Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first official show in Naval Battles Week, although we kind of snuck that one in on Friday or Saturday, whatever it was, Friday. But now we are officially starting it. And Brian E. Walter, my guest today, is his third appearance on the channel. We started with him being a general panel about the Battle of the Atlantic. Then he came back and talked just him about the Battle of the Atlantic. And now he is back to talk about the Mediterranean campaign, which is the subject of his latest book. And as usual, folks, the links to the books and all the things we talk about are in the description below. So don't forget, don't just look at what's on the screen. Go down there, investigate the links. You can find out about the World War II TV merchandise, other book links, websites of various people we talk about, all in the description below. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my guest. So Brian is joining us in the USA. So good evening or good afternoon where you are. How are you today, Brian?
I am doing just fine, and I hope you're doing as well.
I'm doing very well. So, as I said in the top of the show there, you came on and talked about the Battle of Atlantic, and your new book is about the Mediterranean. Back in the first show, you know, your background, you were in the army. You know, your interest in the Navy was always sort of the part-time hobby side of things. But the Battle of the Atlantic we talk about now generally as being the biggest, most important long-term battle. You know, your book, the longest campaign. The Mediterranean, nearly as long, really. More countries involved, more different people involved, more locations. Was it tougher to study the Mediterranean than the Battle of the Atlantic, or was it easier having done the first book?
Well, the truth of the matter is I kind of wrote both books at the same time. So
right.
This is the second edition that's coming out. Now, obviously, as I published the first book, I refined it and I expanded it, and I've done the same thing with this. But the initial core of both books were more or less written at the same time. You're correct. I'll be the first one to acknowledge that the Atlantic campaign was the most important, not just maritime campaign of the Second World War, but it was the most important campaign, I would say, waged by the Allies during the war.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of interesting activities that took place in the Mediterranean, and I certainly think that's an area that warrants our study as well.
Well, to me, the Mediterranean is all about combined arms. It's all about looking at all the elements together, which the Battle of the Atlantic is mostly seaborne and some aviation, but the Mediterranean brings everything in. It brings intelligence, it brings commando missions, operations on the ground, air and sea, and all how they work together. And of course, say that the different number of belligerents and participants makes it kind of complicated to study. But as all my guests, you've come prepared with a PowerPoint that I'm controlling tonight, so I fire it up. And folks, basically today, Brian is going to take us through the presentation in kind of one fell swoop, really, and then we'll do a little bit of questions as we go along if anything comes up. But maybe we'll do the questions at the end, and I will just jump in occasionally with some comments there. But basically, we're going to sit back and focus on the Mediterranean with kind of three parts. The last one being the invasion and liberation of Greece, and the second part being Operation Torch, and the first part being how did we get up to there for the Mediterranean. So plenty of scope for conversation. So basically, I'm going to hand over to Brian to give us a decent history lesson.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul. Again, I want to just say that it's a pleasure to be here to have a chance to talk to you, and as well as your esteemed viewers. Again, to reiterate, my name is Brian Walter, and I'm the author of the forthcoming book, Blue Water War, the Maritime Struggle in the Mediterranean and Middle East, 19 to 1945. This was a colossal struggle that was fought over a period of 5 years, primarily pitting the forces of Great Britain and the British Commonwealth, and then later the United States, against the combined power of Italy, Germany, and at times the Vichy French. And I'd love to be able to talk about the whole scope of this campaign, but of course that would take far too long. We'd still be here talking this time tomorrow. So today we're just going to, as Paul indicated, we're just going to primarily look at about a 2.5 month period of that conflict, which takes place between the middle of August 1944 through the end of October 1944. But before we get there, I'm going to spend probably about 20 minutes just laying the background of the activities that were going on within the Mediterranean theater up until that point. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first 3 years in the Mediterranean conflict were primarily dominated by the campaign and the fighting that was underway for control of Africa. Now, there were two components to this. There was the battle for North Africa, which I'm sure all the viewers here are very familiar with because it's been very well publicized. But there was also a concurrent campaign that was underway for control of East Africa, which has gotten far less notoriety. And I'm going to first address this East African campaign. At the beginning of this conflict, the Italians did maintain colonies in East Africa. Most predominantly, you had Eritrea, you had Italian Somaliland, and then you had Abyssinia, which of course is present-day Ethiopia. And in January 1941, the British launched assaults into the Italian Eastern Empire from both north and south. This was a prolonged offensive that at no time consisted of more than 5 imperial and Commonwealth divisions. And during a period of about 10 months, the British conquered all of Italian East Africa, a territory of about 700,000 square miles. And in the process of this, they eliminated an Italian force of about 290,000 men. This included over 200,000 men that were taken prisoner, an estimated another 15,000 that were killed, and the rest simply were native troops that deserted and disappeared into the landscape. In terms of material and maritime losses, the Italians lost 7 destroyers, 2 torpedo boats, 4 submarines, and about 43 merchant ships worth 255,000 tons. So a fairly substantial defeat for them in terms of both manpower and material. British losses in return were about 6,000 combat casualties and no principal warships that were sunk. So it was a very lopsided victory, and it was the first complete British offensive victory of the Second World War. Now, the fighting in North Africa is going to be much more protracted. It's often been described as a seesaw or a pendulum in which the momentum will swing from one side or to the other. And again, there'll be many key battles, and we're all familiar with Erwin Rommel and Bernard Montgomery and El Alamein and so on and so forth. But eventually, the Allies will prevail in North Africa and destroy all German forces, Axis forces located there. Next slide, please. Now, of course, during the process of this, there's a maritime struggle, which is also going on within the region, predominantly centered in the Mediterranean, but also in some of the other surrounding waters. And overwhelmingly, this maritime contest is focused upon supporting or trying to perpetuate the logistical struggle which is underway. I would say at least 95% of all maritime activities that take place during this period are directly or indirectly tied to this logistical contest. Either you're trying to logistically supply your own guys, or you're trying to prevent the other guy from logistically supplying his. And even the major naval battles that are fought during this time frame, really, at their core, you're trying to control the oceans. So again, you can perform this logistical mission. So this is overwhelmingly about logistics. And there are 3 main components to this that I'll be addressing now. The first one, and if I can direct people to look at the map that's on the left side of your screen, the first deals with British efforts to maintain their forces in the Middle East. Now, the core of British military power in the Middle East was in Egypt, which is located in the northeast part of Africa. Prior to the war, the British would have simply sailed ships, through the Mediterranean in order to support those forces. But now that they're at war with Italy, they can't do this anymore because Italy's, core of power is located in the central Mediterranean, where Italy itself is located. And I have that little circled area to the north of Africa. That's the central Mediterranean, and it is impractical for the British to try and sail ships through there. Now, in fairness, during the course of the campaign, they will have a few convoys that will proceed through the Mediterranean, but these are one-off type operations, which are surprisingly successful. But nevertheless, the bulk of the materials that are flowing to the Middle East cannot flow via this route. And so the British have to attain a different route, and the only possibility for them is to circumvent the continent of Africa and bring the supplies into Egypt via the Red Sea. Now, this is a long and arduous route. It adds about 8,500 miles to the transit of the ships involved. The total distance between the United Kingdom and Egypt via this route is about 12,000 miles. And quite frankly, most of the nations engaged in the Second World War would not have been able to sustain such a logistical effort. Certainly, they wouldn't have been able to sustain this over any period of time. But fortunately, the British, with their sizable merchant fleet, their sizable navy, and the global infrastructure that they have in place, are able to execute this mission and execute it successfully. Now, a second potential danger associated with this is that area that's circled on the eastern edge of Africa, That's Italian East Africa, and it's located right at the bottleneck where you enter into the Red Sea. The Italians do have a naval base there in Eritrea. They have a naval squadron station there, and they do have aircraft in East Africa. And if they're able to exercise control over this area, they have the ability to basically derail the entire effort if they're able to do this successfully. But fortunately, from the get-go, from the beginning of the conflict, the British are able to neutralize this threat to a fairly substantial degree. And then, as I said, in 1941, they invade and they conquer Italian East Africa, eliminating the threat altogether. And so once this is withdrawn, it turns out that this route, which is, again, long and slow, but it will prove to be relatively safe. And the British are able to adequately supply their forces and over time substantially build them up in the Middle East. And then towards the end of this campaign, they're actually providing lavish amounts of supplies to their forces. And just give you an example of some of what we're talking about. The first 8 months of 1942, via this route, the British will ship a total of 192,000 men, almost 600 tanks, over 1,700 guns, over 13,000 vehicles, and about 250,000 tons of supplies to their forces in the Middle East via this route from the United Kingdom. Additional resources will be coming in from North Africa and from the Commonwealth. So again, a large flow of supplies that are coming in, and at minimal cost. During that 8-month period I talked about, just one single British merchant ship will be lost. So a fairly successful endeavor for the British, and again, something that I have to highlight that most of the nations involved in World War II would not have been able to pull this off, but the British were. Now, if we go ahead and we take a look at the map on the right, we'll talk about the Italian situation. The Italians from the get-go are going to abandon their forces, at least logistically, in East Africa. And they're really going to focus their entire effort on controlling the central Mediterranean and, as far as Africa is concerned, supplying their forces in Libya. They have two main ports there. They have Tripoli and then they have Benghazi. And from an Italian point of view, this should seemingly be a relatively easy task to carry out because they literally only have to ship their vessels across the Mediterranean, a trek of a few hundred miles compared to the 12,000 miles that the British are sending their ships. But there's a fly in the ointment, and that fly is Malta, which is located some 60 miles off of Sicily. It's this little enclave of British territory that's otherwise surrounded in this area of Italian control. And from Malta, the British are able to launch attacks against the Italian convoy routes and their supply lines. This particularly will beef up in 1941, and from thereafter, they will use attacks with aircraft, with submarines, and even surface warships. So while this Italian route is relatively short, only a few hundred miles, it's also contested. And throughout this period, the British will be constantly attriting the Italian merchant ships and the handful of German merchant ships that are also present supporting this operation, to the extent that by the time you end the African campaign, the Axis has lost over 2 million tons of merchant shipping in the Mediterranean, and this has pretty well decimated the Italian merchant fleet. Now, in turn, how successful are the Italians with, again, their German allies in supporting the forces in North Africa? I would say they're successful enough to keep those forces going, but they're never successful enough to allow those forces to truly be successful. Throughout this period of time, supply constraints will constantly deter the Axis forces from fully being able to execute the type of things they want to do. They're always operating on a logistical shoestring. And there'll be a number of key battles, such as the Crusader Battle, Alam Hafa, and both First and Second Al Alamein, where, again, Axis supply constraints are a factor in the British victories that are obtained in these battles. So again, they're able to keep their forces going, but they're never able to keep them supplied enough to truly be successful. And then, as we'll discuss shortly, eventually the whole thing will collapse, and this will lead to the precipitous destruction of all Axis forces in Africa. But before we do that, there's one other aspect of this logistical struggle I want to talk about, and again, that deals with Malta. Now, unlike the bulk of British forces in the Mediterranean and the Middle East that can be supported, via this route around the continent of Africa, you can't support Malta that way. It is located in the central Mediterranean, and you have to send convoys into the central Mediterranean in order to sustain the colony. So a third aspect of this is the British sending convoys into the central Mediterranean to support Malta, and the Italians and the Germans trying to impede this. And during the first 2.5 years of the conflict, the British will send 35 convoys to support Malta. Surprisingly, given the fact that they're sailing right into the core of the Axis area, these convoys are surprisingly effective. And for the bulk of them, the British suffer minimal losses. There is an exception, though, during a period of about 8 months from February 1942 through August 1942. This will become a very difficult time for the British to supply those forces. You'll have some epic convoy battles that occur here, including Harpoon, Vigorous, and most notably Operation Pedestal. But again, this is kind of the exception. And the rule prior to this and after this is that these convoys go through relatively unscathed, which again is a testament both to the effectiveness of the British effort, but it's also kind of a acquisition against the Axis, that they weren't able to control their own territory better than what they did.
Just to jump in with a question, Brian, because it's my turn.
Yes,
again, you've come from an army background. You're an American, and I'm thinking about when I was reading about the Mediterranean 20, 30 years ago. It seems one of the faults of the British is that we separated the three things and we wrote about them very much on an individual basis. So we wrote about the desert campaigns. So we talked about El Alamein and Tobruk and Monty in the desert. Then there were other books about Malta and Malta's struggle. And then there were other books about the various naval engagements. And the problem was we didn't put those three stories together into the same one, because that's what I'm beginning to understand over the recent years, is that they all completely connected. And without treating them as a whole, you're kind of missing the whole point. Because as you said there a few minutes ago, the pendulum nature of the North African campaign is, of course, it's to do with the deployment of armored divisions and people like that in the desert, but it's just as much to do with which supplies are arriving at which port, depending on who's got the port at what point of that campaign. So coming at it from that American point of view with the historiography we have available to us now, is that a fair criticism of the British writing sort of 30 years ago? We weren't bringing it together as one story.
Well, yeah, I think that's a fair observation. I mean, I know a lot. One of the things I've learned the more I delve into these things is ultimately it's all about logistics. You cannot underestimate the importance of this. You can take your tactics and you can take the prowess of the generals involved, but if you don't have logistics, you will not be successful. And just to reiterate what you were saying before, we talk about the pendulum. Invariably, the times when the Allies are doing well is when the logistical situation is favoring them, and the times when the Allies are not doing well, the British are not doing well, it's when the logistical situation is favoring the Axis. And it's very obvious when you see these things. I mean, even the fighting in Africa, again, sometimes it's referred to as like a spring. As once one side gains success and they move into the other's territory, they're moving farther away from their own logistical centers of operation, and they're moving, and their opponents are moving closer to their own. And your ability to move forward is constrained by that. So again, in my experience, I don't know, I was going to say 90% of what determines you're successful or not is really tied to how successfully you're able to maintain your own logistical situation. And commanders, and there's times, for instance, Rommel, who was considered this great military leader, but he would notoriously at times just, to hell with logistics, I'm moving forward. And more often than not, this did not serve him well. Whereas somebody like a Montgomery, who was always focused on making sure that he had his things in balance, actually proved to be, far more successful in the long run. So,
super. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, we'll continue on then. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned before, I would say, and again, this is just my estimation, but at least 95% of all these operations, the maritime operations, one way or another focused on this logistical contest. But there are other ways that maritime power also made contributions to the fighting in Africa. And fortunately for the Allies, these overwhelmingly favored them. And I'll give you two primary examples of this. The first of these is the provision of naval gunfire support, which the British used constantly to support their forces in North Africa throughout this campaign. A classic example of this is during the Crusader offensive, Operation Compass, the first a British offensive into the Western Desert. This was about a 10-week offensive, during which times the British will conquer Cyrenaica to destroy the Italian 10th Army in the process of this and take about 130,000 prisoners. And this battle is really a series of British and Commonwealth formations assaulting various Italian strongpoints, across Egypt and Libya. And in many of these cases, the assaulting British and Commonwealth forces are supported by naval gunfire, including, fire from battleships. And there's one case when this occurs where the Italians are retreating down this coastal road, and they come under gunfire from British warships while they're congested on this road. And you can imagine the devastation that may have befallen them when 15-inch shells are coming in on them. So this naval gunfire support is something that's present for the Allies. It's a force multiplier, and it's something that the Italians really have no answer to, because in no way do they ever seriously try to impede the British ships from doing this, and never provide similar support to their own forces. So this is an advantage that the British and Allies have that the Italians and the Axis can't emulate. Now, a second contribution is the form of amphibious landings. And of course, during this time frame, the main amphibious landing that will occur is the invasion of French North Africa in November 1942. Now, this really opens a second front in North Africa. And the result of this is a few months later, you'll have two Axis armies entrapped in Tunisia. They're ensnared by the British 8th Army, which comes in from the east, and the Anglo-American First Army, which comes in from the west, and it traps the Axis forces. And after a few months of fighting, they entirely collapse. And one of the primary reasons why they collapse is after almost 3 years of struggle, that logistical infrastructure that we were talking about is no longer able to adequately support them. And this will be particularly true in April and May of 1943, when it'll really basically just fall in and on in itself. And the result of this is, for the first time in World War II, an otherwise intact German army will, within a period of a week, cease combat operations, lay down their arms, and surrender en masse. And of course, the Italians will follow suit, and some 238,000 men will be taken prisoner, resulting in a significant loss for the Axis. And this is really driven by, again, this collapse of their maritime lines of communication that bring this about. Next slide, please. So once the fighting in Africa is complete, the Allies will immediately move the contest into Southern Europe, and they will attack Italy directly. The first step of this will be the invasion of Sicily, which is Italian territory. This will occur in July 1943, and it'll take about a month for that to complete the capture of Sicily. While this is underway, the Italian fascist council that's located in Rome will depose Mussolini, and they will form a new government. This new government will immediately begin secret negotiations with the Allies to leave the war. And as a result of this, armistice will be concluded, and it will go into effect in the second week of September, thus prompting Italy to leave the war. And as one of the provisions in this armistice, the Italians will surrender their fleet to the Allies. And as a result of this surrender, a total of 108 vessels, and I have principal warships, and I have them listed here, will eventually come under Allied control as a result of this surrender. Next slide, please. So I want to just highlight this point for a moment, because this is kind of a milestone in the Maritime War, because you have this naval coalition which is opposing Britain and the Western Allies, which consists of these three nations, now all of a sudden is reduced to two. And the Italian Navy, which at the start of the Mediterranean conflict had been the 5th largest Navy in the world, and it was by far the most numerous Navy in the Mediterranean at the time, with some 270 warships. Of course, the Royal Navy overall was larger, but they were spread out globally. And the Italians were initially able to attain local numerical superiority in the Mediterranean itself. And this force has been eliminated from the Axis order of battle. And I just want to highlight that, of course, many factors went into this, and this was definitely the result of combined Allied efforts. But Britain was by far the architect in bringing about these results, because for the first 2 years of the contest, the British had been fighting predominantly by themselves, with some support from some of the other minor Allied nations. but it's predominantly Britain fighting by themselves. And even when the United States does enter the contest in the area itself, Britain is still the dominant player. And you can just see this by the fighting that takes place. In Africa, the British are responsible for inflicting over 90% of the ground casualties that the Axis suffer. And this is no minor number, because during the fighting in Africa, the Italians will lose a total of 31 divisions, and the Germans will lose another 9. So a total of 40 Axis divisions are destroyed in Africa. According to Winston Churchill, total Axis casualties in this campaign are about 950,000. And, that might, at face value, seem like hyperbole, but when you actually look at the breakdown of casualties, and including, obviously, East Africa, you realize that Churchill wasn't far from the mark. And that number is probably fairly accurate. And again, of these forces, about 90% or more than 90% were actually, those losses were actually inflicted by the British. Same holds true when you look at the maritime struggle. Again, up till this point, when the Italian fleet surrenders, the Italian fleet will lose 194 principal warships, of which 78% of those are sunk either solely or partially as a result of British action. So while, again, this situation brings about the collapse of Italy as an Axis partner and the surrender of the Italian fleet is a collective effort. There's no doubt about that. But Britain is the dominant player in this. I think it's important to highlight that. Next slide, please. Okay. So now that the Allies have knocked Italy out of the war, that doesn't end the fighting in the Mediterranean. The Germans have long anticipated that the Italians will do something like this. They already have forces stationed in Italy, and they will simply take over the country, and the Italians will let them do it. And then, of course, the Germans will send further reinforcements into Italy, and Italy will become just another occupied country in Europe like much of the rest of the continent. And for the next 20 months, the Allies will battle the Germans for control over Italy, with the Italians, by and large, being bystanders to the events that are occurring in their own country. Now, to be fair, there will be small contingents of Italian forces that will align with both sides during this contest. But by and large, these forces will really do virtually no fighting. And again, it will be the Allies versus the Germans struggling for control over Italy, and the Italians basically being bystanders to these events in their own country. So now as we move into August 1944, what is the situation? The situation is this. The Allies have advanced up a good part of the Italian peninsula, and they control the lower 2/3 of Italy, along with Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. The Germans, on the other hand, control the northern third of Italy, as well as southern France, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Greece. Next slide, please. Now, at this point in the war, one might reasonably say, was there really much of a naval contest still underway? Because clearly there's still ground fighting going on, but, was there a naval contest, particularly considering the Italian fleet had surrendered the year before? And the answer is yes. Surprisingly, there was still a fairly robust naval war that was underway. And the reason this is able to occur is because the Germans simply move in and German Kriegsmarine and take over where the Italian fleet leaves off. And once the Italians capitulate, the Germans will simply assume the mantle of resistance against the Allies in the Mediterranean. They're able to do this using 3 primary, weapons. The first two of these weapons have been in the Mediterranean since 1941, and that being the German Luftwaffe and the German U-boat arm. And during this earlier part of the battle in 1941, 1942, these German elements, particularly the Luftwaffe, had actually been the Royal Navy's greatest antagonist in the Mediterranean, much more of a threat to them than the Italian Navy had been. Once again the Italians capitulate, the Germans will continue to operate the Luftwaffe and submarines within the area, and these will inflict a handful of casualties against the Allied navies, off of Salerno, off of Anzio, off of places like that. Not a lot of casualties, but a fair number. Now, in fairness, by the time you roll into August 1944, both of these arms are basically mere shadows of their former self, as attrition and the German need to move forces away from the area have taken their toll on them. But the threats haven't been entirely eliminated. Now, the third mention that allows the Germans to continue this maritime war is the use of captured Italian and Allied warships. As I said before, the Italians surrendered their fleet, and 108 vessels come under Allied control. But large numbers of vessels aren't able to get away. By and large, these are smaller vessels, usually no larger than a destroyer. By and large, these vessels are non-operational at the time of Italy's capitulation, and that's part of the reason why they weren't able to get away. These are predominantly ships that were undergoing repairs from battle damage, or in many cases, these were vessels that were under construction and hadn't been completed yet. And of course, the Italians will cause further damage in many cases to these vessels, causing sabotage or scuttling. But the Germans, with the usual efficiency, will roll in to capture these different ports, raise and repair many of these vessels, and put about 3 dozen of them into service in the German Kriegsmarine, along with many large numbers of auxiliaries. In terms of these principal warships, the Germans will break this down into 3 primary categories. The first of these will be torpedo boats. Germans will identify with a TA identifier. These torpedo boats should not be confused with the British motor torpedo boats or American PT boats. Instead, these are basically small destroyer-type vessels, and I have 3 of those demonstrated here. You have TA-15, TA-18, and TA-37, and again, you can clearly see that these are destroyer-type vessels. Another category of warship they use is what they call fast escorts, which identify with an SG designator. Now, most fast escorts are converted merchant ships, but this also includes a handful of purpose-built warships that primarily come from French sources. And I have an example of one of those here, which is SG-21. And then finally, a third category of warship they use is what they identify as subchasers. And they designate these with a UJ designator. Most of these, again, are civilian conversions. A lot of these are converted trawlers that have been put into a military application. But this also includes a handful of Gabbiano, captured Italian Gabbiano-class corvettes, which are bona fide warships. And I have an example of one of those here, that being UJ-6081. So with these vessels, plus various auxiliaries and the Luftwaffe and the U-boats, the Germans are able to continue the struggle in the Mediterranean against the Allies. Now, it's certainly not on the same level that it had been, a year or two before, when the entire Italian battle fleet was employed. But there's still a surprising amount of naval combat that will take place. Next slide, please. Okay, so what of the Allies? In the summer of 1944, the Allies have 4 major missions assigned to their maritime forces. First and foremost amongst these is the Allies have to maintain, again, the vital maritime lines of communication. And this not only includes the vast number of ships now that are traveling within the Mediterranean and terminating in the Mediterranean, but it also includes large numbers of ships that are now passing through it en route to and from the Indian Ocean. Because now, unlike the situation at the beginning of the conflict, with the fall of Sicily and Italy's departure from the war, the Allies have opened up the Mediterranean to their merchant shipping convoys. And the result of this is you have large volumes of ships that are traveling through the area. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, in just a 3-month period, from July through September 1944, a total of 14,989 ships will transit through these areas. And in the local convoy and routing system, the volume of shipping and the primary mission the Allied maritime forces, again, are assigned to fulfill is the maintenance of these lines of communication. Now, a second important mission is to provide material and operational support to the American Fifth Army, which is operating on the west side of Italy. A third mission is to provide similar support to the British Eighth Army, which is operating on the Adriatic side of Italy. And then a final mission is to provide, is to try and interdict German maritime operations off the coastal waters of northern Italy, in the Adriatic, and in the Aegean. And again, surprisingly, the Germans are also using maritime forces to logistically support their forces in these areas. Again, it's not nearly on the scale of what the Allies are doing, but this is still a consistent benefit that the Germans are using to support their own forces. And of course, the Allies are trying to interdict these movements and are causing a continuous amount of attrition to the Germans as they are doing this. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the middle of August 1944, the Allies will add a 5th mission to these 4 missions, and that is the conduct of Operation Dragoon, which is the invasion of southern France. Initially, this will consist of the landing of 3 American divisions along a 45-mile stretch of coastline that is positioned between Toulon and Nice. There are 7 additional French divisions then that are earmarked for immediate deployment as soon as the invasion landings have occurred. And then there are further American divisions which will flow into the area from the United States as combat operations develop. The purpose of this, which we'll get into a little bit later on, is primarily to serve as an adjunct to the Northwest Europe campaign, which is now a couple months old, having been launched in Normandy in June. And this will really serve as an adjunct to those operations in northern France. Next slide, please. Okay, so in order to carry out Operation Dragoon, the Allies are going to do a substantial buildup of forces in terms of the maritime elements associated with this. Eventually, a total of 1,034 Allied merchant ships, or Allied vessels of all types, will participate in the invasion or its subsequent follow-up. Again, you can see the breakdown of the different vessels that are utilized as well as the nationalities involved. Overall, the combat portion of this includes the use of 5 battleships, 9 escort carriers, 25 cruisers, and 86 assorted destroyers. This operation is under the overall command of American Vice Admiral Henry Hewitt, and the breakdown of the forces in terms of nationality is that 59.4% come from the United States, 35.6% come from Britain and the British Commonwealth, and the other 5% come from other Allied powers, most notably France. And the breakdown of these forces and the fact that Admiral Henry Hewitt is commanding this, shows one of the ways in which Operation Dragoon is different from all other amphibious operations that are launched in the European theater of war, in that for the first and only time, this is an American dominant operation. In all other major amphibious landings, be that North Africa, Sicily, and certainly the Normandy campaign, the British are the dominant players in the maritime effort. But here the Americans are the dominant players, as designated by the percentage of forces coming from American assets. However, as you can see, Britain and the Commonwealth still provide a significant part of this force as well. Next slide, please. So the assaulting forces will be broken down into 4 primary attack groups, those being Alpha, Delta, Camel, and Sitka. The first 3 of these attack groups will land the American 3rd, 45th, and 36th Divisions from west to east, while the 4th attack group, Sitka, will perform operations on the flanks of the invasion. All 4 of these attack groups have assigned bombardment groups that will support them and provide naval gunfire support. In all, about 60 Allied warships are employed in these operations. As well as that, each attack group has assigned minesweepers and Dan layers that will sweep and lay and establish swept channels to the assault areas to ensure that mines are not an issue for the assault. Next slide, please. All right, in addition to the naval armada that is assembled for this, the Allies will eventually earmark some 4,000 aircraft in order to support Operation Dragoon and the subsequent liberation of southern France. Most of these aircraft will come from the Allied Mediterranean Air Force, but this will also include a dedicated naval element, which is in the form of Task Force 88, which consists of 7 British and 2 American escort carriers under the command of British Rear Admiral T.H. Trowbridge. These carrier aircraft embark upon them some 224 strike aircraft. These primarily consist of Seafire, Hellcat, and Wildcat fighter bombers. And Task Force 88 is assigned 3 missions in the course of Operation Dragoon. First and foremost, they are to provide air defense for the fleet. Secondly, they are to provide spotter support to the bombarding warships. And a number of the pilots on both the British and the American carriers have been trained to perform this specialized function. And then finally, they're also, as situations allows, there to conduct offensive fighter bomber sweeps against the Germans' hardened positions as well as infrastructure targets. Next slide, please. The German defenses that are oriented in order to defend southern France are relatively weak. at the time of the invasion. The main headquarters that is assigned to this defensive application is the German 19th Army. This consists of a total of 7 understrength infantry divisions, which are deployed along the French Mediterranean coastline, as well as 2 further divisions that are held in reserve, a Panzer Division and a Mountain Division. But of this combined force, only 2 of the divisions are in the area that the Americans will assault. The Luftwaffe strength by this time is practically non-existent. They have a total of 65 serviceable aircraft that are immediately available to impede the Allied invasion. And the situation with the Navy isn't much better. At the time, the Germans only have 6 U-boats left in the Mediterranean, of which only 3 of those are located in the Western Mediterranean, of which only 1 of those is operational. They also have 2 flotillas of warships that are in the immediate combat area, but most of these are auxiliary and minor type vessels of minimal combat value. Certainly no match for the armada that they're about to face. And of the vast bulk of the purpose-built warships that we were talking about before, those aren't in the area. Those are primarily in the waters around Italy, the Adriatic, and the Aegean. So the Germans really aren't in much of a position to be able to seriously impede this invasion. And that, of course, will prove to be the case once the Allies launch this, which will be on the 15th of August, 1944. The airborne and commando units will land shortly after midnight. The main assaults will begin going in at dawn, and the Allies will encounter minimal German resistance. The only exception to this will be at Camel Red Beach, where persistent German artillery fire will prevent the Allies from executing their landing there. But the Allies will simply shift the allotted landing craft to an adjacent beach. And by night's end, the Americans are firmly ashore, and in most cases, their formations have advanced far beyond their initial D-Day objectives. And of course, thereafter, the Allies are able to execute an accelerated buildup to the point that after 3 days of landings, by close of business on the 17th, the Allies have 86,575 men, 12,250 vehicles, and 46,140 tons of supplies ashore. And of course, this buildup will continue as the battle develops. Next slide, please. Now, as to be expected, the German response to this is feeble and is not really able to have any impact upon the landings. The Luftwaffe response is so feeble that the British Air Ministry will later describe it as too inconsequential for comment. Now, in fact, the Luftwaffe is able to sink a single LST with a glider bomb and a couple other vessels, but that's the extent of their accomplishments. As for the Navy, they accomplish nothing and only suffer heavy losses for their efforts. This includes on the morning of the invasion, when the American destroyer Summers will encounter 2 German warships, those being the fast escort SG-21 and the corvette UJ-6081 off Port Cross, and it'll sink both of those. That same day, a group of British minesweepers will encounter 5 German patrol vessels and sink all of those for no loss to themselves. And then 2 days later, the American destroyer Endicott will team up with 2 British gunboats to engage 2 German warships. You have the corvette UJ-6082, and you have an auxiliary subchaser. And again, these Allied warships will sink both German vessels for no loss to themselves. Now, as far as the sole German U-boat that's operational at this time that's in the area, that is U-230. This will sortie out from Toulon on the 17th. It'll accomplish nothing, and it'll scuttle itself 4 days later when it accidentally grounds on shallow water. In addition to this, there are a number of other German warships that are located in the area, but by and large, these are non-operational at the time of the invasion, and all will be either sunk by American bombing or German scuttling. This will include 2 more U-boats, 2 torpedo boats, and 4 fast escorts that are sunk during this period. Next slide, please. Okay, so while this is underway, the Allies will break out of the lodgment area, and they will begin their reconquest and liberation of southern France. In this, they are greatly aided by a decision that the German authorities make on the 16th to abandon their positions in southern France and withdraw their forces northward. Now, the exception to this will be at Toulon and Marseille, where the Germans will leave behind some 31,000 men to garrison those ports. And the idea behind this is they want to deny usage of those ports to the Allies, or at least deny them as long as they possibly can. But unfortunately for the Germans, the troops that they leave behind are predominantly naval personnel, Luftwaffe, or administrative personnel of dubious combat value. And once these forces come under assault from French ground forces, who in turn are supported by the heavy guns of the Allied warships, the defenses around both Toulon and Marseille will quickly crumble, and both ports will be in Allied hands by the 28th of August, along with 28,000 German prisoners. So the decision to leave these men behind really serves no useful function for Germans, and actually proves to be a waste of manpower, because the Allies are able to capture the ports very quickly nevertheless. Of course, while this is underway, the bulk of the German army retreats northward. In this, they're pursued by American forces, and they're also harried by French partisans and come under constant air attack by Allied air assets. This includes the operations of Task Force 88, which during the course of Operation Dragoon will fly over 2,300 sorties. Many hundreds of these are offensive fighter sorties. And again, during the course of these aircraft from Task Force 88 will destroy or claim damage against some 750 Axis vehicles, 21 locomotives, 20 assorted barges and coastal craft, and about 19 German aircraft. Allied losses to Task Force 88 will amount to 43 aircraft in return that are destroyed through combat operations. Next slide, please. So by the 15th of September, basically a month into the operation, the Allied armies advancing from southern France now advanced into central France, and they come under the command of General Dwight Eisenhower. And from this point on in the campaign, all combat operations that will take place in France do so under the auspices of the Northwest Europe campaign. And the role that the Mediterranean forces will now play for the remainder of this contest is simply to provide logistical support to these operations. In this regard, in the 40 days following the launching of Operation Dragoon, the Allies will clear a total of 550 mines and will open up 6 different French ports in the French Mediterranean area. This does include both Toulon and Marseille. And through these ports, then the Allies will be able to begin delivering a torrent of supplies, which again, you can see the monthly breakdown of these as they occur. During the first full month of operations in October, they'll send a total of 524,000 plus supplies through. And then for the remainder of the war, the average number of supplies that will be delivered through the French Mediterranean ports will amount to 493,772 supplies. So a major logistical effort will be carried out through this area, and predominantly this will go to support the American 6th Army Group, which of course is Eisenhower's southernmost command, which in turn will eventually operate and advance deep into southern Germany itself. So the execution of these logistical operations is the primary purpose and benefit behind Operation Dragoon. And as I said before, the whole purpose of this is to serve as an adjunct to the greater contest which is underway in Northwest Europe.
And just to jump in, they're going to give you a 2-minute break again. I think this aspect of the supply need through Dragoon is really overlooked. It's the amount of times I read a Normandy book that says, you know what, we didn't need to bother with Dragoon, because they look at it purely in terms of the tactical seizing of French towns and the territory. And they very rarely seem to mention the supply issue, which is, I'm glad you're breaking it down there with those statistics on the screen, because that to me is a key element of it. And Dragoon just generally being forgotten is a shame.
Well, certainly. One of the things I'll just point out, since we're talking about this again, just to give you an idea of the scope of what the Allies are doing here. Those figures that you're seeing for the amount of supplies that are offloaded. Now, earlier in the presentation, we were talking about Axis efforts to keep their forces supplied in North Africa. On average, the Axis were only able to deliver about 80,000 tons of supplies a month, compared to, what the Allies are delivering into southern France, many times greater that amount each month. So again, it just gives you the scale of operation. And again, this is just a fraction of the total resources the Allies are providing to the forces in Northwest Europe. So the logistical undertakings that the Allies are executing during this time in the war are just tremendous on their scale. And it's really, again, other than Britain and the United States, nobody else could have carried out these type of operations during World War II. They simply would not have had the maritime power to be able to do this. All right, next slide, please. All right, so these logistical operations were the key and the primary focus of Operation Dragoon. But Dragoon also provides other benefits to the Allies. Amongst these is it eliminates the last vestiges of German air and naval power in the Western Mediterranean. Now, as I indicated, or maybe I didn't indicate, yes, I did indicate. The Allies had, in fact, opened up the Mediterranean to their passage of ships with the capture of Sicily and Italy's capitulation from the war. But these convoys still came under periodic attack from German U-boats and aircraft, particularly in the Western Mediterranean. Now, with the execution of Dragoon, that threat has been entirely eliminated. And for the remainder of the war, really, all of the naval and merchant shipping traffic that will go through the Mediterranean will do so unimpeded. A second major contribution that Dragoon provides is it helps compromise the entire German position in all of France. Of course, again, much of this is tied to with activities in Normandy, but this is an adjunct to that. And it really compromises their entire defensive position, and it forces the Germans to launch a prompt withdrawal from France. Now, the exception to that is against the French Atlantic ports, which are located in the Bay of Biscay. And again, the Germans will leave behind a little over 110,000 men to garrison those ports with the same idea as at Toulon and Marseille. They want to deny those ports to Allied usage. But again, kind of as it worked out in southern France, this proves to be kind of a fruitless gesture, because the next month in September 1944, British and Canadian forces will capture more useful ports in northern France and in Belgium. And once these ports are opened, it really renders the French Atlantic ports unnecessary to the Allied war cause. So the fact that Germans leave these 110,000 men behind really serves no useful purpose to them. Of these forces, about 38,000 will eventually be taken prisoner when the Americans do capture Brest. But thereafter, the Allies will allow the remaining 75,000 Germans to simply wither on the vine, as they have no need for these ports. And these forces, again, will really serve minimal useful benefit to the Germans, and it was probably a waste of manpower assets to leave them behind. But since they do control these ports, unfortunately for them, they can't utilize the ports for their own benefit. Prior to this, the French Atlantic ports had been the main bases by which the Germans had conducted their U-boat campaign into the Atlantic. And with these areas now being surrounded, basically enclaves in an otherwise sea of area that's controlled by the Allies, the Germans can no longer use them for this purpose, and all U-boat operations are instead moved to Norway. The problem with this is that Norway's bases only can handle about a third of the number of the U-boats that the Atlantic ports had handled, and they're farther away from the patrol areas. So by having to abandon this area, this will impede German U-boat operations for the remainder of the war. And adding insult to injury, in the process of abandoning this area, the Germans will suffer very heavy losses, which in August and early September will include the loss of 3 destroyers, 2 torpedo boats, 22 U-boats, 23 fleet minesweepers, and some 350,000 tons of merchant shipping. So very heavy losses that they incur. And again, this of course occurs outside of the Mediterranean theater itself. But again, the success of Operation Dragoon was one of the elements that led to these events and lead to this disaster that the Germans will end up suffering in the Bay of Biscay. All right, next slide, please. And so now, as we get ready to wrap up Operation Dragoon, we'll talk about some of the casualties that were directly related to the fighting in southern France. And surprisingly, considering that the Germans don't really attempt to defend southern France, they still suffer some very heavy losses there, which include, during the course of the operation and subsequent liberation of southern France, some 78,000 prisoners that are taken by the advancing Allied armies. It also includes 12 principal warships that are lost. And again, I kind of categorized those earlier. And in addition to that, some 97 merchant ships worth 279,305 tons are either sunk or seized by the Allies. So both in terms of manpower and material, this is a heavy defeat for the Axis. Against this, Allied losses are much less. Total Allied losses, ground losses for the campaign amount to 12,911 casualties, and naval losses are practically non-existent. No principal warships are lost. The Allies do lose one LST, and they lose 12 other minor vessels. So again, kind of address what you were talking about before, Paul. The Allies gain a great deal of benefit, and they inflict a fair amount of harm against the Germans for really minimal cost to themselves in regards to Operation Dragoon. And in that regards, I think the operation, in many respects, is very successful. Okay, next slide, please. So we're done with Operation Dragoon, but we're not quite done with our presentation yet, because even as Operation Dragoon was winding down, events were occurring in the other side of the Mediterranean that offered the Allies additional opportunities for both military and political exploitation. In particular, what we're talking about is the deteriorating situation on the Eastern Front, as well as Romania and Bulgaria's decision to leave the Axis, left the German forces in Greece dangerously exposed. And there was a fear that these forces might be cut off from the advancing Soviet armies. And as a result of this, Hitler uncharacteristically decides or agrees to withdraw these forces from Greece. The Allies, of course, will learn of this through Ultra and other intelligence sources, and will very immediately devise plans to harry these retreating forces and to quickly follow them up. The purposes of this are twofold. First, from strictly a military point of view, the Allies want to inflict as many losses upon the Germans as they possibly can. But even more important than this, they want to ensure the orderly return of a friendly Greek government once the Germans have withdrawn. And this desire to do this is driven by the knowledge that communist partisans in Greece are poised to take over the country once the Germans depart. And again, the Allies want to prevent that. Each side now, next slide, please. Each side now has their competing missions, and they will go about the process of collecting the forces in order to carry those missions out. For the Germans, this will include the assembly of 52 merchant ships worth 27,230 tons. Now, I'll just point out at this time that when you look at the tonnage of the vessels involved, these are not large merchant ships. And that'll give you an idea of the attrition that the Germans and the Axis have suffered to this point, where the vast majority of the larger merchant ships are gone. They've been destroyed. They've been seized by the Allies, or they're non-operational in the different ports. And this will kind of give you an idea of what's left for the Germans in order to be able to utilize. In addition to this, they will also use large numbers of military vessels. Again, the majority of these are auxiliary types, but this will include a handful of torpedo boats, including 3 torpedo boats that they bring in from the Adriatic to support this operation. They will have upwards of 200 kayaks, which are local Greek fishing vessels that they have available to them. And they will assemble about 80 transport aircraft to carry out aerial evacuations of the Aegean Islands. For their part, assembling forces for this undertaking is not necessarily an easy thing for the Allies to do, because not only are they still winding down operations in Operation Dragoon, but they've just launched a major offensive in Italy called Operation Olive. The purpose of which is to breach the German Gothic line. And this involves both of the Allied armies in Italy, along with about 20 divisions. So the point being is there aren't a lot of idle forces readily available to go ahead and throw into this liberation operation in Greece. However, despite this, the British are able to put together an improvised force. And I say the British because unlike Operation Dragoon, which was predominantly an American-run affair, this is overwhelmingly a British-run affair. And the British put together this scratch force. The main naval element of this consists of Force 120, which is under, again, the command of Rear Admiral Trowbridge. And it consists of 7 escort carriers with a total of 140 strike aircraft, 7 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 11 escort destroyers. The British will also call upon submarines and coastal craft to participate in these interdiction operations. They'll have access to shore-based aircraft from the Allied Mediterranean Air Force, as well as RAF Command Middle East. And then finally, they will assemble 2 British Army brigades, an airborne brigade and an armored brigade, along with various Royal Marine and Free Greek units to conduct this liberation campaign. Next slide, please.
Just one question about
Sure.
the Greek fishing vessels. Were they crewed by Germans, or did the Germans press into service the Greek crews?
You know, I don't definitively know the answer to that, but I would suspect that they were certainly under German authority, but I'm sure there were some Greeks that were probably pressed into providing, because I just don't think the Germans had the manpower. And this would be true of many of some of the warships and stuff. In many cases, again, those were German officered, and they definitely had partial German crews. But in many cases, those are still partially Italian crews that were also servicing many of those captured warships. So I'm sure in many cases, these were, at least part of this was manned by impressed, Greek personnel.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So, yeah, next slide. Okay. So the interdiction operation will begin, at least the naval portion of this, with Operation Outing. This begins in the second week of September. This consists of a series of offensive sweeps by British warships, as well as carrier airstrikes from the escort carriers. And some highlights of these operations during this time frame will include, on the night of 12 to 13 September, the British destroyers Trowbridge and Tuscan will attack a small German convoy north of Crete, where they will sink the transport Tony and 5 minor vessels. 2 nights later, the cruiser Royalist, which again I have pictured here on the left, as well as the destroyer Teaser, will intercept and destroy 2 war transports, KT-4 and KT-26 off Cape Spatha. On the 16th and the 17th, the British will launch carrier operations against both Crete and Melos, during which time they'll destroy or damage some dozen or so caiques and other local craft, and about 30 motor vehicles. During that same time frame, the cruiser Aurora will bombard Melos Harbor and destroy a merchant ship and 3 other vessels located there. And also during this time frame, British and a Polish destroyer will encounter one of the last German U-boats in the Mediterranean, that being U-407 in the area, and it'll sink that U-boat. And then finally on the 19th, British aircraft carriers, 4 of them, will launch an attack against Rhodes Harbor, which will result in destruction of a merchant ship and 3 other vessels, and damage 3 depot ships and a transport there. All right, next slide, please.
We have another question again from Sean Brennan.
Sure.
Why was British force given a number, Force 120? Most British naval groups I know are by letter, Force HZ, etc. Was it because it was a temporary grouping?
I have no idea. That's a great question, and unfortunately, I'm not sure. But I agree with you that calling it Force 180 was a little bit not unusual, and unfortunately, I don't know.
They're just getting the war is coming to an end. They're just running out of letters of the alphabet, so they're being a bit more inventive. It's we get it with the code names of the beaches, things like why are there exceptions to these things, and it's just
right.
Sometimes it's an imponderable question.
And again,
the answer is there is no answer. Someone just a stroke of a pen said let's call it that, and there was no thought given to it.
Well, and again, too, it was thrown together pretty much at the last minute. I mean, basically, these are the same escort carriers, and part of this at an operation off Dragoon, they just switched them now to the other side of the Mediterranean. But unfortunately, I can't give you the definitive answer of why they referred to it as Force 120.
No problem. Right, moving on.
All right. So now for the next 2.5 weeks, the Allies will continue their interdiction efforts into the Aegean area. As a result of this, at least another 18 German vessels will be sunk. In addition to this, the British, again, are also operating submarines during this time frame and through the scope of these interdiction operations, which in turn will also sink another 4 side merchant ships as well as minor vessels. And then by the time you roll into October, second week of October 1944, the British now are able to operate warships right, alongside the Greek mainland. And in the process of some of those operations, some highlights of that will include on the night of 6 to 7 October, the British destroyers Termagant and Tuscan will intercept a small German convoy in the Gulf of Salonika, where they will sink the German torpedo boat TA-37 and 2 other vessels for no loss to themselves. 12 days later, these same 2 British destroyers will score a similar success when they encounter and sink the German torpedo boat TA-18 in roughly the same area. During this time, British carrier aircraft will launch a series of attacks against both maritime but also ground-based aircraft in Greece itself, targets in both Greece itself. This will result in, among other things, destruction or heavy damage to 30 assorted vessels, 12 locomotives, and over 100 vehicles and railway cars. In terms of some of the maritime successes that are gained during this time, these British carrier aircraft from the 7th through the 9th, British sea fighters will destroy 2 merchant ships, what they describe as a Dresden-class tanker, as well as a barge and a Sybil ferry. They'll also damage the German torpedo boat TA-38, which is underway, and they'll damage this so severely that it'll have to take shelter in Volos Harbor. And then on the 11th, Hellcat fighter bombers from the escort carrier Emperor will attack 3 different convoys in the Gulf of Salonika, and during which time it'll destroy 9 coastal vessels and damage 9 more. Next slide, please. So while these different interdiction operations are underway from a naval point of view, the Allies are also using shore-based aircraft to interdict this evacuation to whatever degree they can. And this will come in 3 forms. The first of these is direct attacks at sea, which will primarily be executed by British bullfighter strike aircraft. Again, I have a picture of bullfighters on the left-hand side of your screen. During September alone, these bullfighters will carry out various strikes into the Aegean area, where they will sink at least 2 German mine layers and 6 other vessels. A second component of this interdiction operation will be to try and interdict the flow of Axis transport aircraft, which again are carrying out aerial evacuations. Part of this will be done through, bombing and raids against the local German airfields. But then as the campaign develops, the British will also move in the fighter direction ship Ulster Queen into the area. And on a number of nights, Ulster Queen will direct British night fighters to intercept and engage these transport aircraft. And through the duration of this evacuation, the Germans will lose about 45 of these transport aircraft and 20 more that are damaged. And then finally, and probably most prolifically, the Allies will carry out bombing raids against many of the local ports within the region. And again, some of the highlights of that will include on September 15th, American bombers will attack Salamis, where they will sink the torpedo boat TA-14, a military transport, and 3 other vessels. On the 24th of September, some 9 days later, American bombers will attack Scaramanga, where they will destroy 2 U-boats and 4 other vessels. And I will highlight that these last 2 U-boats that are sunk are the last 2 remaining U-boats in the Mediterranean. So after a period of almost 4 years, the U-boat threat that existed in the Mediterranean is now gone. In fairness, the Germans still do have control over a handful of captured Italian submarines, but these are all either non-operational or the Germans will never use these operationally. So the U-boat threat now is entirely eliminated. On the 15th of October, British bombers will attack Piraeus, where they will sink the torpedo boats TA-15 and TA-17. Both of these torpedo boats are non-operational at the time of the attack, having been previously damaged by British aircraft, and they're essentially finished off by this raid. And then the next day, on the 13th, British and South African aircraft will attack Volos, where they will sink the aforementioned torpedo boat TA-38, which again had taken shelter there following damage from the Fleet Air Arm strike. But they also sink 2 large merchant ships and about 25 other vessels that are in at the time. Next slide, please. So while these various interdiction operations are underway, the British are going to carry out a number of landings yet at certain strategic points in southern Greece. This include a number of Aegean islands where the British will land on. In most cases, they will encounter small German or fascist Italian garrisons that they will take prisoner after offering little or no resistance. In some cases, the British will also combine their efforts with local partisans in order to clear areas like the northern Peloponnese or to capture the Albanian port of Saranda. In the process of these different operations, the British will essentially establish a presence for themselves in southern Greece, and they'll take about 4,000 prisoners during these undertakings. So even though you're only talking about very limited numbers of British troops that are involved, they're still having a material result there. By the middle of October, the British are ready to take this to the next level, where they will, and on the 13th, elements of a British airborne brigade will begin landing at Megara airfield outside of Athens. 2 days later, elements of these airborne forces will enter Athens itself, where they'll find indeed that the Germans have evacuated the capital. That very same day, the British will land the British 23rd Armored Brigade, as well as 3 Greek units at Piraeus, which of course is located near Athens. This is all part of Operation Manna and is supported by 2 British escort carriers, a cruiser, and 6 destroyers. There is no German opposition to these landings, although British carrier aircraft will destroy a couple of German aircraft that stray into the area. And the British are able to successfully unload a total of 5,000 men, 400 vehicles, and about 1,000 tons of supplies by the 17th. On the 18th, the Greek government in Naval returns to Athens and will take control over the country from this point on. For the remaining 2 weeks of the month, the Germans will continue their retreat from northern Greece, and they will continue to be harried by the British. During the course of this, the Germans will suffer the final losses, maritime losses of this campaign, which will include the torpedo boat TA-39, which is sunk on a mine. A large German hospital ship is captured by a British destroyer, Kimberley, and the German mine layer Zeus, which, along with other vessels, is scuttled when the Germans abandoned the northern Greek ports. Next slide, please. So this pretty much kind of concludes then the operation to liberate Greece. And for the British leadership involved, they can be fairly happy again with the results that they were able to attain. First and foremost is the establishment of a pro-Western friendly Greek government. Now, as I think most of your viewers, I'm sure know, this government will come under immediate attack, as there will be a large-scale insurrection by communist insurrectionists thereafter, but with British and later American help, this insurrection will be beaten back, and this Greek government will remain in effect. This will provide the Allies with a small but important political victory in the post-war world. Well, it will ensure that Greece is part of the Allied camp as opposed to the Soviet camp during the Cold War. Beyond this, it's successful in inflicting heavy losses upon the Germans, particularly in terms of the maritime forces employed. The Germans will lose 7 torpedo boats, 3 U-boats, and 3 mine layers that are lost. Of the 52 merchant ships they gathered together, 29 worth 19,434 tons are sunk directly. Of what remains, most of those are scuttled, along with other vessels that are scuttled during this time frame. Total German merchant losses from scuttling during this period, in just the month of October alone, amounts to some 40 vessels worth over 54,000 tons. And again, most of these losses occur in Greek waters. So materially, it's some heavy losses sustained by the Germans. And then finally, notwithstanding the 4,000 prisoners that I mentioned that had been taken earlier during early British landing operations, the Germans are successful in evacuating about 70,000 men from Crete, Rhodes, and some other Aegean islands. But they leave behind some 26,495 German and 12,000 Italian fascists, again, on those locations. These men that are left behind, almost 40,000 strong, are cut off, isolated, and basically impotent. And they serve no useful function to the German war effort. And again, the Allies will let these forces wither on the vine, but for all intents and purposes, these men are lost to the German, war effort, and they might as well have been prisoners of war to the value that they provide to the Germans. So that is another loss that you have to take in consideration here, that the men that they're forced to leave behind. Overall, in return to this, British losses are nil. I mean, I'm sure they suffer some ground casualties, and I'm sure there's some air casualties associated with it, but there are no naval casualties to speak of. So then, again, this is a very lopsided victory in that regard. Next slide, please. And this is kind of the conclusion of my presentation. To wrap this up, I just want to, again, stress 4 points about these 2 campaigns we've talked about. The Operation Dragoon and the liberation of Greece. Point number 1 is that both of these were immensely successful in attaining the objectives that the Allied leadership had set out for them. Number 2, in both cases, the Allies are able to inflict far heavier losses upon the Germans than they themselves suffer. In some cases, the losses that the Allies suffer are practically non-existent. In both cases, the Germans suffer some fairly heavy losses. Number three is, while these are clearly both combined arms operations, but I think it's fair to say that at their core, these the foundation of this was maritime power, and the ability to execute these operations was based upon maritime power. And then finally, despite the successes that both of these operations attained, I think it's fair to say that both have been largely overlooked by history. And that is particularly true of the Greek campaign, which is almost entirely ignored by history. And so I hope today that we've gone a little bit of a way to try and redress this omission. I think it's fair to say, to a large extent, the Mediterranean struggle is replete with examples of this. I talked before about the East Africa campaign. That's another major campaign that has been largely overlooked by history. And while as I said earlier, I'll certainly talk about the importance of some of these other areas in the Atlantic and Northwest Europe, but that doesn't preclude the fact that there's a lot of important and interesting things that are also going on in the Mediterranean during this time that I think warrants our investigation.
Well,
and
definitely.
With that, I will conclude, and if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer those.
Well, my first question is, for some reason your audio just gone a little bit weird these last 30 seconds or so, but it's just maybe, but anyway, we're hoping it's okay. But my first question, then we'll open up to the viewers, is the first point is, I think, referencing what I said earlier, I think the British interest in the Mediterranean does seem to wane after about 1943. I mean, the historians' interest in it, the readers' interest in it. It's once we land in Italy, once we land in Normandy, it seems that we just lose focus on what's happening there. So that's my first observation. Interesting as well that the conversation, the sidebar right at the beginning, was about carriers, aircraft carriers, and you've barely mentioned carriers. And I think there's a bit of a British obsession with the big stuff. The carriers, and again that kind of connects to Malta again. And I think in talking about this, or in focusing on those aspects, we collectively have ignored some of the other parts of the Mediterranean campaign at our cost, I think. So again, from an American point of view, because generally when I'm trying to think of any other shows I've done about the Mediterranean that weren't either with a British or Australian guest. And I think you're the only American who's talking about the Mediterranean. I think so. So is that, do you think you came into it with a bit more maybe objectivity about it, and you weren't burdened with perhaps the Malta story that's important to us British? You weren't perhaps burdened with some of this focus, and that was enable you to kind of see the whole battle maybe possibly better?
Well, I want to emphasize in my book, I always cover everything. I mean, I cover all the carrier operations, I cover all the battles, I cover it all. Obviously, we can only touch upon certain aspects of this in an hour-plus presentation. I grew up reading about this stuff when I was a young man, and I read about the Toronto raid and all that type of business. So I don't know that I would be any less inundated with some of the things. But again, I think when you're looking at the grand scheme of things, you realize that, again, as I said before, all of these things are really only important to the extent that they influence, the end result. And, the battles of themselves, well, quite often, and I'm guilty of this too, we like to sometimes keep score, it's 2 warships to none, but at the end of the day, it's not the losses of those warships that's really important. It's the impact that it has on one side or the other side's ability to support these operations and carry these things through. And sometimes, like I said, I've said this before, I'm not, logistics aren't necessarily the sexiest thing in war. Sometimes we like to focus on these other things or some of these other aspects. And again, I do focus on them in my book, but it's these mundane things like logistics that are really what drive and naval gunfire support and amphibious landings. And those are the things that are the elements that really drive your ability to be successful. And some of these, great naval battles like, Toronto, Cape Matapan, some of the great convoy battles that take place in the Mediterranean. While I certainly cover them in the book, and they're interesting, they're very interesting. But again, they're interesting to the degree, how does this impact the greater position? And I don't know, did I do a decent job answering the question, or was I just kind of talk around it a little bit?
I think it was good, and I think, Brian, we will call it a day, because for some reason your audio has just started to break up a bit. But then at least we got the presentation okay. So the gremlins are coming, and we had them a couple of days yesterday with Alex Kershaw. But we will bring the things to an end. So I'm going to remind people again, folks, don't forget the link to Brian's books, both of them, the new one about the Med and the older one about the Atlantic, are in the description below. If you are new to the channel, please don't forget to click like to every video you watch. I enjoy watching and reading your sidebar conversations. Also, take a minute after the show to leave a comment as well. It all helps with our analytics. It all helps with the algorithm to get our shows noticed, so we can keep building our presence on YouTube, because it's slowed down a bit, understandably, with what's happening in Ukraine. Views have dropped a little bit, but they're up again today, and Alex Kershaw yesterday, so it's good. But I'm going to just go back and say thank you to Brian. Don't forget, folks, we've got 2 shows coming your way tomorrow. So in the morning, for me, that is, so 10:30 GMT, we are talking about the Royal Indian Navy, and we are going to be touching on the Mediterranean because, as Brian said, there are various players in there, the British being the big one, but the Royal Indian Navy had a presence there, as they did pretty much every campaign in the war. And then later in the evening, in a change to the schedule, I've had to postpone the show about the USS Tide, and we're now bringing Nick Hewitt in, to one of 2 Nicks coming in this week. Nick Hewitt tomorrow, Nick Stanley on Friday, and Nick Hewitt is going to talk about the Eastern Convoy. So that is the convoys down the east coast of the UK that brought things like coal and steel down to the southeast of England. So that'll be fantastic. Nick Hewitt is an amazing naval historian. He used to work at HMS Belfast, and he'll be a great presenter tomorrow. So that's what's coming up tomorrow. So 10:30 in the morning GMT and 7 p.m. in the evening GMT are 2 shows tomorrow. But right now, I'm going to bring Brian back in, basically just to say goodbye and thank you. And I hope you've enjoyed talking to our erstwhile flock, and we can't wait to have you come back for a 3rd or 4th show.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Okay, then. Well, thanks, everybody. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I'll see you all again for the 2 shows tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Thanks, Brian, and thanks, everybody, for watching. Bye.